Okay, so for this example, we're going to be building an override that pulls in a movie, and that movie is going to come from TMDB, which is kind of like IMDb, but they have a really cool free API. So to use their API, you need to sign up at themoviedb.org. Once you've signed up, go to your profile and create an API key. You have to enter in a few details about what you want to do, and they'll issue you a key, much like this one, but you'll need this API key to authenticate your request to TMDB. And I'm showing you how to do this because this is how most APIs are going to work. You're going to need to pass them an API key with your request to get information back. So if we hop over to the documentation and scroll down to the movie list segment, click on the popular movie list. This is the API we're going to be calling, and basically it just returns the current most popular movies, and it returns 20 of them. So on the right here, it shows you a code example, and you can select the language you want the example in. I've selected JavaScript. You can see that it's pre-populated our request for us, and it actually uses your API key to fill out this example. And inside of here, it's just a fetch, and it's doing the same thing we did in the last example. And as soon as it gets the response, it's just pulling the JSON out and then logging it. But it's important to note that these options are being passed into the fetch request, and those will help authenticate our request. So to get started, what we need to do is just copy this code example. Hit that button, and then we'll head back to Framer. Now in Framer, we have our movie component, and if we click into here, we have a couple of variables set up. We have one for the movie poster, as you can see here, that's used by this poster image, and it's also used by this little blurred reflection image down here. And then we have the title, and we have the date, and we have a movie description, which we call overview. If we go back up a level, you can see that I've created an override called with movie. So if we look at this sort of empty code override, it looks very similar to the one we made in the last video. So let's run through it quick. We've set up some state called movies, and it's an empty array, and this is where we're going to populate the movies we fetch from the API. Below that, we have a use effect that calls this fetch data function, and inside of there we have a fetch which is currently blank, and this is where we're going to be adding our URL. After we fetch the movies, we then call setMovies to add them to our state. And then lastly, at the end of the use effect, we call this function to make all of this happen. So first up, what we need to do is just paste in that code that we copied from TMDB. So if we paste it in here and save to format, you'll see that it's very similar to the code that we've written up here. Now, the important bit is this options object, which does all the authorization and authentication for our request. So let's just move this above the fetch and press save. And then you'll see there's a little bit of a difference between their code and our code. In our code, we are storing the response in this variable, and we are also calling await because we want this to happen asynchronously. So we can pretty much just copy this and we'll paste it in place of that. And let's just remove this console.log line over here. And over here, we want to call console.log, and we're going to log the response, and we're going to log the state. So we're going to log movies. Okay, so we can see that the response is working. We're fetching the movies. We have this results list inside of our response object, and every entry is a movie. One thing to note is that our movies state is actually empty. That's because when this console log is first run, the fetch, which is asynchronous, might not have come back yet. And this is kind of important because we need to handle a case when there aren't any movies yet. So what we're going to do is down here before this return, we're going to say if movies.length greater than 0, then return this component. And then we're going to pass in all of the properties we want to our component if movies has been populated. So the first thing we want to test out is title. We're going to make it equal to movies, and we're going to select 0, so the first item, and we're going to say title. You can see that that updated pretty instantly. So the next field we want to get is this overview field. So we're going to pass in overview, and we're going to do the same thing. And now we have the overview text. And let's do the same for the date. So we know that that variable is called date, and we're going to pass in movies 0 .date .release date. I think there's an underscore there. There we go. And then the last thing we need to handle is the actual image poster. And we only have the last bit of this URL. So what we need to do is sort of do something like this. Poster equals, and then we're going to use backticks, and we're going to do $, and we're going to pass in movies.poster, and then underscore path. And then back in the TMDB documentation, they have this basics guide on working with images. You can see that this is what the URL should look like. And this poster path is this bit. So we just want to copy this bit and head back to Framer, and we can just paste that in front here and press save. You can see now we have the poster, and we also have the little reflection down here. So one thing I don't like is the way this date is formatted. Now, what I could do is format it in code over here, but actually we can just work with Framer's variable system to do that for us. So if I go back to the component, and you can see that we pass in a date variable here, but it's just a string. So what we need to do is go into the component, and let's remove this date variable, and let's make a new one that has a type of date, and we'll keep the name as date. Let's just click away from there, and then we're going to hook this up to use that variable, and we're going to format it from here. So I'm going to say I want the long version, and that should be about that. Now when we go back to our code override and we preview this, you can see the formatting is handled for us. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is create two overrides that help us go forward and backward through this list. Now the way we do this is to set up an index in the store. So we have our store over here, and we're going to say index equals, I'm going to make it 0 for now, which will keep it the same. And then within our use movie, we actually want to read from the store. So we're going to do this store set store. We don't need the set store for now, but I always just pull it in. And now we can read this index over here. So we can say store.index, and we'll just copy this over to each of these. And now when we change this value, you can see we get a different movie from the list. So next up, we just want to create two new overrides, one for each of these buttons. All they're going to do is change this index number. Okay, so I quickly jumped ahead and created two blank overrides. One is called with increment index. The other one is called with decrement index. And for now they're blank, but we need to go apply them to our component. So we're going to select the right arrow, add a code override. Let's go down to movie, and we're going to say with increment index, and do the same for the left. So go in here and with decrement index. Okay, so now that those are applied, we need to finish writing our code overrides. So this is going to work in much the same way as the counter override we built a couple of lessons ago. So what we're going to do is add a click handler and pass it a function. That function we'll call set store, and it will change the index to be store.index plus 1. And we'll do the same for this one, except now it'll be store.index minus 1. So now we can page through the list of movies that's stored in our state over here. Now we still have a couple of rough edges because we might get to the beginning of this list and go past the limits of our movie list. There is no -1 point in that array. So to handle this, we're going to put some limits on our click handler. So we'll wrap this whole thing in a set of curly brackets, and we'll say if store.index does not equal 0, then return this, and otherwise just do nothing. So now when we get there, there's no effect. But we also need to change the variant so that it doesn't look clickable. So we'll do that quickly. And so we'll say store.index equals 0. And if so, we're going to return a disabled variant, and otherwise we'll return the active variant. So now when I get there, you can see that we've got a disabled version. Now we actually have the same problem at the top end. There are only 20 movies in this list, but instead of hard coding some logic so that this stops advancing at the number 20, I want to use the actual length of the movie list so that if that ever changes, we don't need to update the code. So the way we do that is we're going to add another entry to the store. We're going to say movie count, and by default we'll give it a value of 1, and then we're going to go back to our with movie override, and in the same spot that we set the movies, we're going to set the store, and we're going to make it so that movie count is equal to response.results.length. And hit save. So when the list of movies is fetched, we'll set the upper limit to the length of that list. And then we're going to sort of copy the same logic we have over here. So let's copy this onClick handler. And instead of -1, we're going to say +1. And instead of this condition, we're going to say store.index is less than store.movieCount. Then you can advance. And we also want to change the variant to be disabled if it is the last item in the list. So we can copy this code over, and instead of store.index equals 0, we can say if store.index equals store.movieCount -1 disabled. So now if we go all the way to the end of this list, it should work. But it actually still breaks because we need this to be store.movieCount -1. So now if we do this, we get to the end of the list and we can no longer advance. Okay, cool. So that's pretty much it for this lesson. And in fact, that's pretty much it for this code overrides course. Stick around for a bonus lesson where we do an advanced override that you can use to filter items without the CMS. But if that doesn't sound interesting to you, I hope you enjoyed this mini course. Cheers.